Thank you so much, Ben. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. So delighted that so many of you are joining us from all over the world. There are opportunities and challenges involved in online programming, but one of the opportunities is the chance to speak to a much wider audience than we would otherwise engage. So welcome to the virtual Huntington. The Huntington is the appropriate place for a program on this theme because, of course, it holds the literary archive of Hilary Mantel. And we have been delighted over recent years to welcome several scholars who have started to make exhaustive use of that archive, including one of the conveners of today's conference, Dr. Lucy Arnold, who I will introduce in a moment. There are many thank yous that I have to offer. First of all, to Ben Tuttle, our wonderful production, AV production manager, whose voice you just heard in welcoming you. Ben is holding the hands of our conference speakers over the next couple of days as we make sure presentations can be shared effectively. Thank you, Ben, for all your hard work behind the scenes. To my assistant, Catherine Werry Miller, who's done a great deal of work in working with the speakers, not only in designing the program, but also in helping us migrate the program online at relatively short notice. Thank you too to all the speakers themselves who've maintained their commitment to the program, despite the fact that they weren't able to come to Southern California to enjoy the gardens here at the Huntington. We would have shown you a really good time, but we're nonetheless delighted that you are online with us today. So before I introduce our conveners, who are of course to be thanked also for putting this wonderful program together, I want to offer a personal tribute to Hilary Mantel. You'll hear a great deal over the next couple of days about her astonishing skill, both as a researcher and as a writer of fiction. And I emphasize those two things together. But also I want to pay tribute to her warmth and good humor. And I'm going to do that with an anecdote. So when she spoke at the Huntington in 2017 in a conference on historical fiction, I introduced Hilary by pointing out that I was something of a heretic when it came to her historical novels, because I don't believe that Wolf Hall is her finest novel. I said to her in front of a large audience that I thought A Place of Greater Safety was her best historical novel. I said that novel is so good that I read it on my honeymoon. And remarkably, I am still married to Louise Hindle. Well, Hilary thought that was hilarious. And at the end of the evening, I bought another copy of A Place of Greater Safety and asked her to sign it. And she did very happily. And she wrote, "For Louise, I believe I owe you an apology." And I think that perfectly sums up the warmth and good humor and immense generosity of the person to whom we're paying tribute over the next couple of days. So thank you, Hilary, in your absence, for everything you have done for historical fiction. It's my pleasure to thank and introduce in her absence Dr. Eileen Pollard, who, as you know, until very recently was Senior Lecturer in English Literature at the University of Chester. With Lucy, she's been the co-convener of this program. She completed her PhD on the writing of Hilary Mantel in 2013 and is co-editor of Hilary Mantel Contemporary Critical Perspectives with Jeanette Carpenter, who sadly can't be with us for the program, which was published in 2018, and co-editor with Berthold Schörner of British Literature in Transition, 1980 to 2000, Accelerated Times, which appeared with Cambridge in 2018. Here with us, I'm delighted to say, is Dr. Lucy Arnold, who's lecturer in contemporary English literature in the Department of English, Media and Culture at the University of Worcester. She was educated at the University of Leeds on the wrong side of the Pennines and is the author of the monograph Re-Reading Hilary Mantel, Haunted Decades, which was published in 2019, a book which was partly researched with the help of the Huntington Research Fellowship to work on Mantel's literary archive, which is held here in San Marino. Thank you, Lucy, for everything you've done in putting this program together. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I would just like to echo those thanks to yourself and your team, who have just been, they've gone above and beyond to make this excellent program happen under really quite complicated circumstances. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce our first panel today. on interdisciplinary approaches to Mantel's work. I'm going to give a very, very brief introduction to our speakers, David Kenny, Peggy Ellsberg, and Lucy B. Dutton, and then I'm going to hand over to them, and then we'll have around half an hour for some questions and comments on those papers. I'll introduce our speakers in the order that they'll be presenting today. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Dr. David Kenny, who's an Associate Professor of Law at the Law School in Trinity College Dublin. He's a graduate at Trinity College Dublin and Harvard Law and the Honourable Society of King's Inns, and is also a Fulbright alumnus. His research is on Irish and comparative constitutional law, and his current research concerns constitutional culture and referendums and the constitutional implications of Brexit for Ireland. And David also writes, fortunately for us today, on law and literature. His article, Love Mounts to the Throne with Law, Citizenship in Northern Ireland and Seamus Heaney's Antigone, is forthcoming in Law and Humanities in 2022. Our second speaker will be Dr. Peggy Ellsberg, who's a senior lecturer in English at Barnard College, Columbia, graduate of Radcliffe College and of Harvard. Her publications include The Gospel in Gerard Manley Hopkins, selections for his poems, letters, journals, and spiritual writings. And I believe Peggy is also a poet. Her chapbook, Riding Out, was published by Catty Wumpus Press in 2017. Our final speaker this evening will be Lucy B. Dutton. Lucy is an independent scholar with an excellent name who gained her PhD in 2018 from Birkbeck University of London. Lucy's research focused on early film, and she also specialises in embroidery and quilting as a way of exploring academic and cultural questions. And she'll be speaking today about her latest project on Mantel's Cromwell trilogy, and specifically Wolf Hall. And that is more than enough for me. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our first speaker, David. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for that very kind introduction. I'll try and share my presentation, and if everyone can see that, I'll begin. Again, thanks, Lucy, for that really kind introduction. Thanks so much to Lucy and Eileen for putting this together, and so much to everyone at the Huntington for hosting us. I can certainly say I wish I were in Southern California rather than exceptionally dreary Dublin, but it's a pleasure to be here nonetheless. And it's a great pleasure to open this panel on interdisciplinary perspectives with a very interdisciplinary perspective. My paper will look at law, language, and magic in Hilary Mantel's Cromwell trilogy. And as you'll have gathered from Lucy's introduction, I am a lawyer and therefore really something of an interloper here, but I do believe that law and literature as a discipline can really be useful in expanding our understandings of the law as lawyers, and also every once in a while perhaps bring something to the table for literary perspectives as well. And I think that one of the most useful aspects of law and literature, one of the ways in which it is most well used, and at least the way that I like to use it, is using literary examples to make legal points, to essentially highlight or argue for legal theories. And I think that this is especially useful when it comes to critical legal theory. Critical legal theory is something that I'm very interested in, and something that can be very hard to argue for. In terms of legal materials, materials that lawyers take seriously, it can be hard to make deep critiques of the law. And I think literature, in offering us a very different perspective, can really aid in our understanding of certain critical views of the law. I think that Hilary Mantel's Thomas Cromwell trilogy is exceptionally good for this. And I have written previously in the journal Law and Literature about how I think her character of Thomas Cromwell is maybe the archetype of a legal pragmatist, and explains legal pragmatism as a school of legal philosophy more effectively than perhaps any other text, literary or otherwise. And I wanted to sort of try again, and I was so delighted when I saw the call for papers for this conference, because I also think that these books are really fantastic as an illustration of the rhetorical account or the rhetorical theory of law, illustrated so marvelously by Mantel's treatment of language in the books, and also her fantastic equation of law and magic. People might remember from Wolf Hall that when you were writing laws, you were testing words to find their utmost power. Like spells, they have to make things happen in the real world. And like spells, they only work if people believe in them. So my case today is that Mantel shows us how law and magic are fundamentally the same in being branches of rhetoric. They are both fundamentally exercises in persuasion. And that's what I hope to discuss in my brief time here today. I have a longer written version of this paper, and I'll share a link in the chat after I conclude. So to begin with looking at Mantel's treatment of language in the Thomas Cromwell trilogy. As both Lucy and Eileen have written about in their own excellent work on Mantel, her work and the Wolf Hall books in particular focus very much on the dual nature of language. Language is, on the one hand, fleeting, impotent, almost insubstantial, something that is really trivial at times. Thomas Cromwell will say to Thomas More, all you have to do is say some words, like it's really no big deal. And we find out that rats have eaten the laws of ancient times. So really, this writing words thing, not all that important. But somehow at the same time, we see in the books that words are solid, lasting, and supremely powerful. Cromwell tells us the world changes by the pen stroke that alters the force of a phrase. And in a conversation with Wyatt, that perhaps it was not by a serpent, but by paper and ink that evil came into the world. So we see here a liminality of language, that language exists in a strange state of supreme power and also a strange kind of impotence. And this is summed up, I think, most effectively by Thomas More's words that echo throughout the book. Words, words, just words. First said to Cromwell by More when they were both boys in Cromwell's recollection. And Cromwell asks, what is in the book that More is reading? But we know that they're not just words, because when we read these books, we see that so many of the clashes that Mantel paints in Tudor England are over words themselves. We see it in the repeated clash over oaths, how far Cromwell has to go to get More and the Lady Mary to swear their fealty to the king. We see it in the translation of the Gospels. Thomas More would chain you up for a mistranslation. He would, for a difference in your Greek, kill you. This is really quite consequential stuff, and we see in the various clashes over the Gospels being translated quite how serious it is. And thanks to Cromwell, words themselves are treasonous, and so many of Henry's clashes with his various rivals and enemies come down to matters of words. And strangely, when we see Cromwell interacting with language, we see that language is absolutely crucial, but also strangely almost trivial. Cromwell will go to such great lengths to have Lady Mary swear an oath to the king and pledge her fealty. But when he is told afterwards that Lady Mary fakes her obedience, he says, Lady Shelton, I don't care. He says to Thomas More that all he has to do is say some words, and yet we see in the extraordinary lengths he goes to when the words aren't said, quite how serious those words were. And Cromwell essentially knows this because he is a master of language. He is perhaps the ultimate master of language. He has almost complete control over words. He knows no way to draft, but to cover every circumstance. This is a man who can make words do his bidding. But at the same time, in this strange contradictory way, he knows that meaning and the meaning that the words take on is not fully in his control. Power, after all, is in the hands of the reader, he says, not the writer. And so he exists in this liminal space where language is at the same time as clear as glass and as unstable as water, somehow incredibly firm, but also at any moment ready to collapse. And he knows he exists in this intermittent space, and he is very happy there. There are some people in this world who like everything squared up and precise, he thinks, and there are those who will allow some drift at the margins. He is both of these kinds of person, and he knows when to be which one. He knows when he's drafting a lease, he can leave nothing to doubt, but when he's drafting a contract, he needs to do just that. He knows when it's important to try and use language to entrap meaning, and when he should use language to escape it. And the first place in the books where we really see this extreme of language playing out is with magic and magic words. And in defining magic, which we, I suppose, have to do first, I'm going to take Keith Thomas's definition, Thomas being an absolutely incredible historian of magic in the early modern world. Keith Thomas says magic is a spurious attribution of effective virtue to the mere enunciation of words. That is, magic is saying words and thinking that good or effective things happen as a result. And Keith Thomas and also Chris Godson in his more recent history of magic note that the primary purpose of magic was to solve problems and to work out social tensions. That's the social function that magic solved. That's why magic was so pervasive in Cromwell's time. And we see throughout the Thomas Cromwell trilogy that we have magic all around. Prophecy and omens, witchcraft perhaps in Henry's own household with Anne Boleyn, magic rings of Cromwell's that can melt walls and make princesses fall in love with them, fairies enchanting curses. These are all over the place. We know, of course, from Lucy's work, amongst others, that Mantel's work is suffused with ghosts. And of course, the same is true here. There's a buried empire of the dead all around. Cromwell is haunted by the spirits of Anne Boleyn and the courtiers that he has killed and bring up the bodies in The Mirror and the Light. And of course, the most important ghost of all, the ghost of Cardinal Wolsey that speaks to him, advises him. And when the ghost ultimately abandons him, Cromwell says he resorts to necromancy, wishing the cardinal back. So Cromwell is not a person necessarily, other than in talking to the cardinal and seeing ghosts, to really go in for magic. He wants to extirpate magic, and in particular, the magical thinking that undergirds lots of aspects of papist religion, relics, saints' days, etc. And so this is a form of a social phenomenon at the extremes of language that Cromwell's probably not a big fan of. On the other hand, the other extreme of language, we have legal words. And law is the field in the books where the language game is perhaps played most consequentially. We see with Cromwell that law can do absolutely astounding things. It can make Henry head of the church. It can alter the line of succession. It can banish Rome from England entirely, dissolve the monasteries and the court of augmentations. Essentially, with the law, Cromwell redraws the map of Christendom. And while he's doing it, he regularly espouses this arch respect for the law. He stresses that neither he nor Henry can possibly be set above the law, and they must both follow the law in every particular, in every dealing. The law is something that Cromwell cares deeply about, and protecting it is crucial to him. But at the same time, and again in this seemingly contradictory way, he cynically exploits the law and uses very clever tricks of legal language to bring people along with his various plans. This is a tool for achieving his will. And we see this throughout the books. We see that Cromwell knows that Anne Boleyn and the courtiers are almost certainly not guilty of what they're charged with, but he's going to make sure that the court finds them so anyway. We see it perhaps most clearly in respect of the Act of Succession, which makes King Henry, not the Act of Succession, pardon me, the Act of Supremacy, which makes King Henry head of his church. But of course, Cromwell says it doesn't, as some say, make the king head of the church. It states that he is head of the church and always has been. If people don't like new ideas, let them have old ones. If they want precedence, he has precedence. The precedents, as Catherine of Aragon puts to him, are invented. Cromwell made them up, and they are highly, highly dubious. But he did so to bring people along. He points out to the Lady Mary that the king is only head of the church insofar as the law of Christ allows. Lady Mary said that means nothing, and Cromwell responds, "My lady, it means everything." It means everything because it leaves space for people to obey, space for people to go along with the law, even if they might object. Of course, people see Cromwell's tricks. Stephen Gardiner, his great nemesis, highlights the occasion on which Cromwell antiqued a statue of an angel and sold it at a massively inflated price to a cardinal. And he insinuates he's done the same with the law. Statue, statute, not much difference. But of course, Cromwell snaps back, one letter is everything in legislating. So Cromwell sees law as extremely powerful, but ultimately deeply malleable, ultimately something that you use to tell stories in order to get your way. And we can see this too in the limits of the law's linguistic magic in this series of books. There are limits to the power of law. It can't change the physical world. It can't give Henry a son, or he'd have one as soon as Cromwell took over Parliament. But it also can't do things that people just won't believe. It can't rid Cromwell of his vile blood. Not prayer, nor Bible verse, nor statute law can alter the fact of villain blood. Not all his craft and guile can make him a Howard. Cromwell is stuck with his villain blood because if he tried to change it by law, no one would believe it. It wouldn't succeed. And we see, as we go through the books, there is always a risk of failure in Cromwell's great projects of using language and the law to try and change the world. There's a risk that the spell of law just might not work, might not hold. And we see this when Cromwell reflects on the following question: can you make a new England? You can write a new story. You can write new texts and destroy the old ones. You can write on England, but what was written before keeps showing through, inscribed on the rocks and carried on floodwater, surfacing from cold, deep wells. You cannot simply overwrite all the stories that went before, because ultimately people have to believe in it. Whatever the law is asking them to do, people have to have faith that they should follow it. If they don't, people will not obey the law, and the law simply won't be able to work. Remember, law is like a spell. It has to make things happen in the real world, and it only works if people believe in them. Cromwell would say, as he does, that the law has to make a story that people can attach to, so they can maintain their faith in the idea that the law is a good way of ordering the world. And only if people decide that is true, only if people choose to obey, does the law actually have the effect. If nobody believed that Henry was the head of the church, if everyone rejected Cromwell's law, it would not have that effect. Henry's authority wouldn't hold. And on this account then, the law ultimately is persuasion. The law is a way of achieving an end by writing a law and in that action, persuading people to go along with it. That is fundamentally how Cromwell sees the law. And I think that fundamentally is how the law is. To put it another way, and to bring our themes together, law and magic are both aspects of rhetoric. They are both linguistic tools we use to achieve desired ends. And there's several aspects of this that I'd like to point out to try and make this comparison clearer. As we've just discussed, both law and magic need people to believe. If people don't believe in spells, don't believe spells have the effect they claim to, then magic will fall away, as of course it ultimately did. They only work if people believe in them. Both of these disciplines benefit from mystification. They both involve complex incantations, often involving Latin, which give you the sense of something real and serious going on, something powerful, not just an exercise in rhetoric, but something bigger than that. And if it's bigger than that, well, really, shouldn't you go along with it? And that is how law and magic maintain their authority. They also maintain their authority because they have a self-confirming character. Keith Thomas points this out about magic when he says that once you accept its premises, any failure of magic can be explained away as an error of procedure or some other magical property playing out. Postmodernist legal scholar Pierre Schlag says the exact same is true in law. We always have a reason why it hasn't worked, and in fact we can use it to improve the law for next time. So our failures are not problems, they are just excuses for more work. Both law and magic can only be practiced by a very special group of people, people like me, who have secret knowledge that we learnt in secret places. And that helps give the impression, again, that something serious is going on, not just an exercise in rhetoric, not just an exercise in persuasion, but something real, because only this elite and special group can actually do it. And relatedly, both sets of practitioners, lawyers and magicians, have a huge incentive to keep this game going, reputational incentive and financial incentive. Pierre Schlag, again, points this out in law, and Keith Thomas makes the comparison directly in his magisterial History of Magic in Early Modern England, when he says, in a burn that I think lawyers may never recover from, the example of the legal profession is a reminder that it is always possible for a substantial group of people to support itself by proffering solutions to problems which they themselves have helped to manufacture. He's absolutely right, and really quite embarrassing for lawyers if we dwell on it for too long. Finally, in this respect, both law and magic use their dual nature as a resource. That is, they use the fact that they seem to be real, substantial, full activities, full of meaning and power, to give off the sense that there is a continuity and a fixity to this enterprise. But at the same time, the fact that there isn't that fixity, that it's really just rhetoric, really just persuading you to go along, is the ultimate resource, because it means that law and magic can keep adapting to new situations and new circumstances, because it can really go in any direction. And that is why the language of law is just as useful to the autocrat and the tyrant as to the democracy. Law is the ultimate flexible tool for getting the work done. Now, we can also see how law is like magic by looking at the fact that law came to take on lots of the functions of magic. And we can actually see this in the Cromwell trilogy, when Cromwell himself uses the law in many ways that magic was used in an older time. And I'm taking these uses of magic from Chris Dodson's recent History of Magic, published by Penguin. One great function of magic in the olden days was regulation of theft, that to find thieves, you turned to magicians. After Cromwell's time, we retreated to the law and we passed criminal laws of property to do that. That was really all part of Cromwell's modernization project and his gradual centralization of the state into Whitehall. Dodson also says magic was used to readjust relationships between people, objects, the land, etc., to redraw the map of society. Well, could you find a better description of what Cromwell does with the law? Redrawing the relationship with the church to Rome, the line of succession. Cromwell makes a New England by Act of Parliament. Magic is used to predict and control the future. Well, Cromwell has no interest in prophecies, but at the same time, he does have an interest in making a new world and making sure that people go along with this new world that he's created. And so he very much uses the law to control the future, if not to predict it. And perhaps most vividly, magic was used in cursing and witchcraft in order to harm one's enemies. However, we see in these books, cursing is left to the weak. Anne Boleyn curses as she falls, and Christoph Cromwell curses as his master is led away. But law is the weapon of the strong. Law in bills of attainder and treason is how you really deal with your enemies if you're serious about it. So my very final concluding thoughts. I think Thomas Cromwell in history and in these books was at the center of this process. That Thomas Cromwell helped move from the mystical to his ever-expanding administrative state. And this process where magic fell away and the law started to take over was part of what Max Weber called the disenchantment of the world, where the intellectual prestige moved from mystical disciplines into rational ones. And so law is one of the inheritors of magic, and far more like magic than lawyers would like to admit. But the law resists disenchantment. It resists going down that same path of failure that magic had, because it has no rivals at the moment to take its prestige status as problem solver extraordinaire. And it doesn't make any hard empirical claims that you can disprove. And that is why I think magic is dead, but the law endures. And ultimately, I think reading Mantel and reading the Cromwell trilogy illustrates the fact, and I'm taking words from Stanley Fish here at the end, illustrates the fact that the law is something we believe in because it answers to, even though it is actually the creation of, our desires. We believe in the law because it does what we want, but we like to think it's something bigger. But the trick is that it's not. It's just an exercise by which we persuade people to go along with what we want to do. And that, I think, is one of the great lessons we can learn from Mantel's books. Thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to discuss it later.
Thank you so much, David. That was absolutely fascinating as ever. And as ever, I have so many questions for you, but I will hold fire because I'd now like to invite Peggy Ellsberg to present her paper on Holbein and Mantel's Tudor trilogy. Peggy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My paper's about reanimation and revision of two famous characters, well-known characters who already, were established in everyone's minds, Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell. Hilary Mantel in the Wolf Hall trilogy, particularly in Wolf Hall, kind of revises and reverses their reputations. And she uses Hans Holbein's portraits as proof texts of their, accepted identities. And she challenges that. The epigraph that I submitted over a year ago in my abstract is from W.J. Mitchell, Iconology, quote, "The history of culture is in part the story of a protracted struggle for dominance between pictorial and linguistic signs." What can a portrait convey? Hans Holbein's iconic portraits of More and Cromwell face each other across a doorway at the Frick. Holbein transforms a painted surface into a full expression. Stephen Greenblatt says Holbein's Thomas More glows, quote, with a deep thoughtfulness, whereas Cromwell has, quote, piggish eyes. This is in the New York Review of Books in 2009. These portraits are emblems of the consensus narrative of the two men, one a saint and one a pig. Holbein's images of More, the philosopher, and Cromwell, the pig, revising Holbein's images of More, the philosopher, and Cromwell, the pig. Her Cromwell is gentle, moderate, and wise, and her More is sadistic and lunatic. Mantel depicts More's wife, Dame Alice, at a dinner party in her own home, cuddling her pet monkey, while her husband taunts her for being fat. Quote, "Eat, eat," says More, "all except Alice, who will burst out of her corset," end quote. There are no dogs at the More's house in Chelsea, but a monkey, and at one point a rabbit. The Cromwells, on the other hand, are surrounded by dogs. On page 32 of Wolf Hall, quote, "He holds Bella up in the air. She kicks her little legs in glee." And on page 40, quote, "He gathers his papers for the day. He pats his wife, kisses his dog." There are Bellas and hunting hounds and greyhounds. Almost immediately upon meeting the 15-year-old Thomas Cromwell in Wolf Hall, we see his attachment to his little dog. They are all named Bella. His love of dogs runs like a thread throughout the book. John Guy's excellent Brief Life of Thomas More, 2018, confirms that More never kept a dog. Yet, in the film version of A Man for All Seasons, Paul Scofield, as More, is given a beautiful large golden lab who follows him around the house and grounds at Chelsea. And I can't help think that, well, John Bolt is humanizing More even more by giving him such a beautiful dog. David R. Smith in the Art Bulletin comments on Hans Holbein's sketch for the family of Thomas More. Ben, I wonder, oh, wait a minute. Can I do this? No, I can't. Could you show the slide of the group portrait, sketch of the group portrait? I'm sorry that they're not in order. That's it, thanks. This is Holbein's sketch for what would become a watercolor on canvas, which was destroyed in a fire, like so many things from the early modern period, destroyed in a fire. And you will see here, Thomas More, David R. Smith, who's an art critic unlike me, says this portrait quotes his portrait of 1527, which hangs in the Frick, that they're very similar. And this is his father, John More, Sir John More, Thomas More's father, wearing bright red. And this over here is Dame Alice with her monkey. And there is in here Thomas More's fool, Henry Pattinson. That Thomas More kept a fool is not without interest. He notes that Dame Alice is marginalized. off to the far right with her monkey. Her proper place in a Renaissance portrait would have been next to her husband, but she is here banished to the periphery. We know that Mantel is familiar with this monumental sketch, 9 feet by 14 feet, which he describes in Wolf Hall, and we cannot help connecting its cues to Mantel's portrait of More as a misogynist. Both G.R. Elton in the 1950s and Richard Marius in the 1970s psychoanalyzed More as a failed Carthusian who simply could not maintain celibacy and who wore the hair as a lifelong penance. Elton's and Marius's revisionist assumption that More was nothing but a helpless sex addict, driven from the charter house to marriage by uncontrollable urges, seems to enjoy no actual basis. But Eamon Duffy in the TLS believes that this revisionism, quote, provides the prospectus for the character of More as presented in Wolf Hall. Mantel herself says of More, better to marry than burn, but it is possible, we see, to do both. But now look at this slide. And Ben, could you get the other group picture, which is done in colorful oil? It's a revision of this one. This is it. Look at this. Now, this is done after the actual painting was destroyed in a fire. This is done by a guy named Roland Locke in 1592, and it hangs in the Nostell Priory in Yorkshire to this day. And do you see what I see? 2 dogs. We know More never had a dog, but Locke revises More by giving him right at his feet 2 dogs couchant, thus giving More a certain amount of human glory because he's got these invented dogs. A piece last year in the London Review of Books suggests that Mantel carries hostility toward Roman Catholicism and toward the hereditary aristocracy. Some readers have found this latter hostility anachronistic, reflecting a contemporary taste for the demotic. Thomas More's moral stenosis, the review claims, is doubled when his fierce Catholicism appears against a backdrop of personal wealth. Ben, can we go back to the single portrait of Thomas More that we had first? That's it. That's it. Thank you. Is doubled against a backdrop of personal wealth. He collects and wears, in Wolf Hall and in real life, he collects and wears gems and gold and commissions expensive paintings from the master Hans Holbein. Cromwell also commissions at least one painting from Holbein, but he at least is a self-made man. Do you notice the Tudor rose on his gold necklace and other jewelry, and the luxury of his robes with this beautiful tawny fur and fur here and a different kind of fur here and velvet. David R. Smith in the Art Bulletin points out that these props reveal more about the sitter than does his inscrutable face. When in Wolf Hall, Hans Holbein arrives at Austin Friars, Mantel writes Cromwell asking, quote, "How long will you stay with us?" Hans grunts, downs his cup of wine, and talks about what he's left behind. Basel, the Swiss cantons and cities, riots, pitched battles, images, not images, statues, not statues. It is the body of Christ. It is not the body of God. Sorry. It is the body of God. It is not the body of God. It is sort of the body of God. It is his blood. It is not his blood. Priests may marry. They may not. There are 7 sacraments. There are 3. All I ask, Hans concludes, is to do some good work and be paid for it. So Hans is not interested in the religious conversation at all. In fact, the way Mantel presents it he's really bored with it. He's had enough. He's finished. He just wants to get to work and make money. Holbein's discreet renditions are indeed good, and he does get paid, but they are not confessional. John Bolt's play and film cinched Moore's sanctity. John Guy mentions that A Man for All Seasons was so successful that it became the top choice of sixth form dramatic societies in schools across Great Britain, trumping Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. As a film released by Columbia Pictures in 1966, winning 6 Oscars, it remained at the top of the box office for 1 year until the James Bond thriller Casino Royale replaced it. Yet, the first time we meet the saintly Sir Thomas More in Wolf Hall, he is identified not as holy or as an aristocrat, but as a torturer. One rainy evening, Cardinal Wolsey talks to Thomas Cromwell about heretics in the city of London. Wolsey suggests that the right course would be to pray gently for them. But tell them, he says, quote, to mend their manners, or Thomas More will get hold of them and shut them in his cellar, and all we will hear is the sound of screaming. Eamon Duffy points out that, quote, More is described in detail as a torturer 7 times in Wolf Hall and once in Bodies. As a result of the mischief performed by Mantel's works of fiction, it is now widely believed that More personally was a torturer. I observe here that Mantel's genius endows her with the capacity to make her personifications totally credible. She never fails to remind her critics that she is writing fiction and that she is under no obligation to historical truth, though her scholarship is, to my mind, prodigious. Hilary Mantel and Xavier Salomon collaborated on a slim art book. I have it right here. Very sweet, beautiful book, beautifully illustrated, called Holbein's Sir Thomas More, published by the Frick Diptych Collection in 2018. In this book, Hilary Mantel addresses, quote, a letter to Thomas More, Knight. This is the beginning of the letter. When your son-in-law, Will Roper, wrote your story, it was routine to make a life into what it ought to have been. Fortunately, we don't have to rely on secondhand reports from another generation. You talk, you write, you sit, you look at Hans Holbein. Hans Holbein looks at you. Here I read Mantel trusting Holbein to portray something that exonerates her take on More, though honestly, I can't find anything in his portrait that achieves that goal. At one point in Wolf Hall, Mantel describes in traumatizing detail the burning at the stake of an 80-year-old Lollard woman, suggested by an episode in Fox's Book of Martyrs, as witnessed by the 9-year-old Cromwell. Somehow, Thomas More, who was totally out of the loop at that time, probably having a drink with Erasmus, becomes associated with this horror story. In his essay, Dismantling More, Peter Ivor Kaufman mentions that More's chancellorship saw the execution of 6 heretics, whereas Cromwell executed 300 before his own death in 1540, quote, including priests, monks, priors, and 1 bishop. Though the image of Cromwell as looking like a murderer comes up recursively throughout the book, this detail of the 300 executed does not make it into Wolf Hall, and why should it? Colin Burrow, my favorite of all the reviewers I read in preparing this talk, writes, quote, it's Thomas More who truly goes through the shredder. So, you thought More was the valiant, dignified saint, the hero of conscience, prepared to stand up to secular powers and die for his faith? Alas, no. On the other hand, Larissa McFarquhar in The New Yorker writes, quote, certainly Mantel wasn't going to sentimentalize as Robert Bolt did, Cromwell's enemy, the saintly Thomas More, who died for his conscience and made sure that other people died for his conscience too. This is John Guy. Whereas Mantel's Moore is a sneering, conceited, misogynist bigot, a pantomime villain born with a silver spoon in his mouth, her Cromwell is the very opposite. A workaholic and master of spin, he loves dogs and children and understands human frailty. He has blood on his hands, but we might just start to like him. Historical accuracy, naturally, is never the issue. This is a novel. Of Cromwell, Burrow says, there was no shortage of bastards in the early 16th century, but Thomas Cromwell stands out as one of the biggest bastards of them all. His surviving correspondence shows the brutality of someone born to get things done. No one understands exactly how the son of a blacksmith and brewer managed to become the king's principal secretary and eventually, in 1536, Privy Seal. But his energy, efficiency, and brutality played their part. After a while, you wonder whether Cromwell, who felt so deeply, could actually have engineered the dissolution of the monasteries. And this bit from Wolf Hall, this is Colin quoting Mantel, quote, he thinks of Putney, he thinks of Walter, he thinks of the jittery sidestep of a skittish horse, the smell of the brewery. His suppressed grief becomes anger, but what can he do with anger? Jessica Jernigan, in her review of Bring Up the Bodies in the Women's Review of Books, asserts that Thomas Cromwell, quote, is one of English history's most universally detested villains, end quote. But Hilary Mantel has put him through a brilliantly refined rehab and seems at times to even identify with him. She sympathetically makes him sort of wince when he first sees this portrait that Hans Holbein has so famously painted of him. And Ben, could you now put up the portrait? I think it's the next one after this of Cromwell. Yes. You see how in the previous portrait of Moore, he looks like a great philosopher and, well, a saint. And in this, well, he has been compared to a pig. What Burrow says about him, well, what Wolf Hall says about this is that when the portrait arrives wrapped and he and Rafe, I think, unwrap it, he is a little bit shocked. And he says, do I look like a murderer? And Rafe says, you know, you look like a murderer. I have found that numerous reviews, especially those written by English historians, refer to Cromwell as a fixer. Colin Burrow describes Mantel as fixing Tudor history. At one point in Bring Up the Bodies, Cromwell says to Harry Percy, quote, our requirements have changed and the facts have changed along with them. In Wolf Hall, Holbein's finished portrait arrives at Austin Friars and Cromwell slowly examines it. Quote, Hans has made his skin smooth as a courtesan's, but the motion he has captured, that folding of the fingers, is as sure as that of a slaughterman's when he picks up the killing knife. Mantel here narrates a portrait of Holbein painting a narrative. Colin Burrow says of this portrait, his transformation is finally marked by the most artful of Mantel's descriptions of a painting from the period. When Cromwell is at the height of his influence, Holbein delivers to him this famous portrait now in the Frick, which shows Cromwell as a plain, chubby, puffy-faced calculator in black. Wikipedia, which I consulted just yesterday, describes Holbein's Cromwell as arch and dyspeptic, with an overweight face, a double chin, and unnaturally small eyes. And now I'm almost finished. Could we just see maybe the next portrait, Ben, of Martin Luther? This is Lucas Cranach, the elder's famous portrait. And I just want to say that when I was in school, I learned that this represents Protestant art because it lacks all of the sideshows and illuminations and stage settings of Catholic art, implying that the soul is saved by grace alone. Hans Holbein the Younger, for a living, painted the ruling elite, but also was a successful clothing designer. A Northern Renaissance man, he was known for his exquisite renderings of fabric and fur. Hilary Mantel, in the first line of chapter 2 of Wolf Hall, says, so, Stephen Gardner, that's the way Seamus Heaney starts his Beowulf, by the way. So, Stephen Gardner, it's wet, and for a night in April, it's unseasonably warm, but Gardner wears furs, which look like oily and dense black feathers. He stands now, ruffling them. Mantel likes this. For the Christmas revels, one of Cromwell's little daughters wears a costume of peacock feathers. Realism, especially of clothing and jewelry, marks Holbein's method. His sitter's gaze. Holbein's Moor exudes wealth. Holbein's Cromwell exudes murder. Mantel's conversation in Wolf Hall is not with the facts of art or with the facts of history. It is with asymmetric historiography and its emblems, Holbein's portraits, and Moor's and Cromwell's largely unquestioned legacies.
Thank you so much for that, Peggy. That was absolutely wonderful. And it's such a beautiful bridge to our final paper in this panel. So from those sumptuous representations of fur and fabric in Holbein's paintings, we're now going to go to a very different kind of use of fabric in association with Mantel and her Tudor trilogy, with Lucy's paper. Over to you, Lucy.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Well, good afternoon from London, or good morning, wherever you are in the world. And thank you very much for the invitation to present at this conference. I'd also like to take the opportunity at this point to thank the Huntington Library for their very generous contribution towards the cost of quilt photography for this paper. And today I'm going to talk about my experience of stitching, which was inspired by Hilary Mantel's Cromwell trilogy. I'm a quilter and I've been working for the past just over a year on various pieces relating to the trilogy. And today I'm going to talk about the first Wolf Hall quilt. I'm going to start by looking at the act of stitching in the Cromwell trilogy, and I'm then going to talk about the method that I used to interpret the source texts in Stitch. Now, if you've read Hilary Mantel's Cromwell trilogy, you can't fail to notice the central importance of cloth, processes related to cloth, and the uses to which cloth can be put. And Lucy has written about this in her recent book. And when I was listening to David's paper and he was talking about law being conveyed by secret knowledge, conveyed in secret places, in the same way, sewing has secret knowledge conveyed in secret places, and women have rules about what is appropriate to be stitched by whom. And Cromwell knows that there are rules, but he doesn't necessarily know what they are. But what he does know about is cloth. His appreciation of fabrics and his background in the cloth trade allows the reader to enjoy many stitched items. And there are some wonderful ones. There are Margaret Pole's treasonous embroidery pieces, Cromwell's orange coat, which is currently playing a vibrant role on stage in London. There are Jane Seymour's Kingfisher sleeves. And my favourite item of all, one that actually did exist, is Cromwell's own quilt of yellow Turkey satin. Now, the first time I read Wolf Hall back in 2009, I was struck by two particular stitching references which related to difficulties with needles. One of them was the child Jo's awkward little backstitch, which you would be hard pressed to imitate. And her technique, Jo's technique, might not be all that her mother, Joanne, would desire. But Cromwell quickly appreciates its value because he knows that even an unconventional stitch has its uses as long as it holds together. And of course, Jo starts to sew the cardinal's letters because nobody can recreate the way that she sews. And Cromwell tells her that he will give her a present for doing that. The other reference that really jumped out at me related to knitting. And this is a reference to Anne Boleyn. When Cromwell sees her on one occasion, she looks small and tense, as if someone has knitted her and drawn the stitches too tight. Now, I'm not a knitter, but I understand the difficulties of pulling a thread too tight when I'm quilting and watching everything pulling out of line. But it's the descriptions of the actual practice of stitchery that are threaded throughout the trilogy that fascinate me the most. There is a clear understanding that needlework is labour, that it takes time, effort, and skill, and it's a deliberate act. And throughout the three novels, there are characters who recognise this. So just a few of them. We have George Cavendish, and he wants that the chests holding the cardinal's embroidered copes should be lined with a double thickness of cambric, so that the work that has taken nuns decades doesn't become spoiled. Bess Seymour understands the emotional labour involved in unpicking when she is asked to unpick embroidery that was done for her own sister, who has recently died. Unpicking is never pleasant because it represents wasted effort and wasted time, but Bess has this added cruelty that she has to navigate. Cromwell's young daughter, Anne, knows about the labour involved in stitching, and when she sews, she repeatedly pricks her fingers and beads of blood decorate her work. And there's a nice little note that Cromwell will not let his wife strike her for her poor sewing skills. On the other hand, Cromwell's unknown daughter, Yenneker, is a proficient stitcher. Before we meet her in person and before Cromwell knows who she is, he's commenting on her neat stitching, and he wants to know who did it, because he knows that stitching isn't just something that happens. It's a conscious act on the part of the person who plies a needle. And he knows this because he recognises the vital importance of the cloth trade to England's economy. In this world, sewing is never neutral. What is sewn, how it is stitched, and who threads the needle all have an impact on the cut of the cloth. Emblems and badges are embroidered, so as queens change, their supporters are kept busy, unpicking and restitching new emblems to reflect the current state of the king's matrimonial affairs. And the politics of pregnancy are played out by the letting out and taking in of bodices. Cromwell interests himself in embroidery because he knows it can catch people out, and he does so magnificently in the case of Margaret Pole. We watch Margaret Pole sewing and taking loops of thread and slipping her needle through the cloth, and this might look innocent, but Cromwell knows very well that her embroidery is treasonous. He's always maintained that embroidery would get her into trouble, and he knows that it's going to be very useful to have all the evidence stitched together. Now, a close reading of the novels shows that the stitching activities are as various as the mostly women who undertake them and the textiles to which they contribute. And of course, both in the novels and in life, it shouldn't be assumed that because someone can do one type of stitching, they'll be proficient at all. So if, for example, you make quilts like I do, you're likely to be asked at some point to repair someone's dropped hem. If you embroider, you might be asked to take in a dress. And if you're a dressmaker, you might be handed someone's abandoned cross stitch because you can finish it because you sew. But such requests result from a misunderstanding of the difference of technique, skill, and specialism. Patchworkers are not necessarily quilters, who are not necessarily embroiderers, who are not necessarily dressmakers, and so on. And one of the very many pleasures of the Cromwell trilogy is this differentiation in stitchery. From sail making to silk embroidery, the needlework is various and highly specialist. It is weighted with class, expectation, and intent. Now, the most able stitcher in terms of the number of techniques in which she is proficient is Cromwell's wife, Elizabeth. And she uses patchwork and quilting techniques, she embroiders cushions, and she narrows her embroidery down to black work, which she uses when she's making shirts for Gregory. And while the text is silent about this, it's possible, and we can imagine, that she made those shirts from scratch herself. She does silk work, and there's a lovely description. Liz has obviously got the muscle memory to work without thinking, and Cromwell asks her to slow down so he can see how she's doing silk braiding. And she tells him, I can't, because if I stopped to think how I was doing it, I couldn't do it at all. In an echo of Cromwell saying that he would deliberately leave his needle in if he was stitching the king's shirts, as Queen Catherine does, Liz unconsciously leaves her own needle in a piece of embroidery, which, after she dies, leaves a ghost of herself in the resulting bumps in the weave. And I suspect this is a very unconscious habit, because probably every stitcher that you might know does this. It's a very bad habit. We do it anyway. And sometimes years later, we come across a rusted needle, which has ruined the thing that we were making. The different types of stitchery are exemplified in the character of Helen Barr. And that's why I've called the paper after her. Because when we first meet Helen, she explains that she was stitching for a sailmaker, and Cromwell notes that her hands are skinned and swollen from rough work. Now, I'm not an expert in antique sailmaking and the tools that go with it, but from a 21st century stitcher's perspective, I can confirm that traditional sailmaking is indeed very rough work. Sailmakers' needles are terrifying. They're large and they're thick, and you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of one. And to get your needle through heavy canvas or to attach rope, a thimble isn't going to help you. What you need is what's called a sailmaker's palm, and I've got one, I'm wearing it now. It's a leather strap that fits around your hand, and in the palm you have a metal piece which you use to physically push, using all your strength, the very thick needle through the canvas. Now, I bought this one and it's far too big for my hands, and I suspect that these tools are designed for larger and stronger hands than mine, and indeed Helen's. And Helen, of course, is designed for finer fabrics. Cromwell notices how much she enjoys handling the fine stuff once she's married to Rafe Sadler. And as well as handling the fine stuff, the tools and the type of needlework that she does change. By 1536, her hand has turned to fine embroidery. Her thread is now fine silk, and her needle is thinner, shorter, and sharper. She embroiders a kerchief for Dorothea Wolsey, and Mantel describes these as loving stitches that Helen has made to give pleasure to a stranger. But of course, the stranger, Dorothea, rejects the kerchief and rejects Cromwell himself. Dorothea's rejection of Cromwell is shocking enough on its own, but for a stitcher with a keen awareness of the time and effort that's gone into the loving stitches, the rejection of Helen's work is an additional blow. And I noted with relief in the theatre a couple of weeks ago when I was watching the stage version of The Mirror and the Light, Helen's embroidery was nowhere to be seen when Cromwell went to see Dorothea. There is actually no sewing on stage in the new production as there was in Wolf Hall. But the casting is really interesting because Umi Myers plays both Helen and Dorothea. And to me, this is a subtle reminder that these two women are linked by stitch. Now, it's not surprising that a trilogy of novels that pays such respect and attention to the act of stitching has a particular resonance for anyone who sews. And in my case, it's formed the inspiration for a very large-scale sewing project. The project started very casually. Last summer, I was just messing about and I stitched the words mirror and light just to see how it felt. And once I'd done that, I stitched the rest of the chapter titles from the third book. And then I went on and stitched the chapter titles from Bring Up the Bodies. When I'd finished those, I thought I might as well do the Wolf Hall titles as well. And by the end of December, I had a full set. And then I started to think what I was going to do with these things. I had a vague idea that I might make a traditionally shaped quilt, a square quilt, based on the mirror and the light. But something felt really inappropriate about a bed-shaped item based on this particular novel, because, you know, the question kept coming up, how could one sleep under the story of an execution? And I realized what I needed to do when I was watching an online event for the Women's Prize for Fiction. And Hilary Mantel was interviewed, and she said, all the stories are borne along on the River Thames, and the river has its deeps and its mysteries. And that was the spark that made me think I should be working something that was long and thin. That was strengthened by something I remembered reading in the programme for Wolf Hall back in 2013, the Royal Shakespeare Company programme. In there is an interview with Ben Miles, who of course has played and is still playing Cromwell. And the interview was introduced by saying that Miles has taken over an office behind the main rehearsal room, and around the walls snakes an extensive timeline of events compiled from fine combing the books. And this confirmed to me that a long strip was definitely the way to go. And I had a vision of joining together all of my embroidered chapter titles and representing all three books in one long piece, starting and ending with "So now get up." Given that the Wolf Hall quilt ended up being 46 feet long, I have changed that approach because it's difficult enough to handle 46 feet. And I thought, you know, getting on for 100 feet would be even more problematic. Now, the unplanned nature of the project became a problem once I started to quilt it. The embroidered chapter titles were fine as standalone pieces, but once I layered them into the three layers that make up a quilt, the lettering became slightly distorted. Some of the chapter titles were longer than others, and I hadn't left myself enough space for adding additional work, either images or wording. I worried about this for a while, and then in the end I decided it wasn't worth worrying about, because the other thing I was very aware of was that I was doing this work during a pandemic when I was spending a lot of time on my own at home, and I felt if I started again from scratch and didn't use the titles I'd already sewn, there would be a sort of dishonesty about that, because I wanted it to reflect the time that it was made. And while I wasn't entirely happy with the lettering style that I'd used, I knew that it was better than trying to do anything that was of the period. I wasn't going to try to reproduce Cromwell's handwriting. A few people asked me if I was, and I decided that would be a very bad idea because it would look like I didn't know how to sew. I had this idea that I'd be staring at these 16th century documents in bafflement and then executing an image of the stitching really quite badly. But I did include two examples of 16th century lettering. In the novel, there's a reference to Henry putting a heart in a signature of a letter that he sends to Anne Boleyn. Those are in papers held in the Vatican. It's a letter from June 1528. So I tracked down an image of that. And then, of course, there's the text of the announcement of Princess Elizabeth's birth, which is held in the British Library. And I put that on the quilt as well. But those were the only two places where I used anything of the lettering of the period. So what else is in the quilt? Well, I spent 8 months quilting images and text, and I've just got a gallery of some of them to share with you. There are Wolsey's Cornish chuffs. I looked up what Catherine of Aragon's livery badge looked like and found that in the Museum of London collection. There's a lot of talk in the novel about the emerald, which is shattered en route to London. And then I wanted to make direct reference to Cromwell's own quilt. I used the snake that bit Cromwell in Italy as some background work. Wolsey's rings are in there. Every time certain pieces of jewellery, Wolsey's turquoise, Francois' ruby and Cat's holy medal are mentioned, I make sure that they find their way into the quilt. And Grace's hand on the Book of Hours, which was actually quite distressing to do when I look back on it. Peggy mentioned the peacock feathers earlier, so Grace's peacock feather wings had to go in there. Wolsey's warden pears are there. I'm not happy with the design of those, but they were the right thing to put in because it's such a significant last meal that Wolsey ate. Joe's awkward little backstitch made an appearance, and there were various items that were embroidered onto one of Wolsey's copes, and I used some 16th century patterns for those. In part 4, Yenneker's needle, I really wanted that in there because I felt that Cromwell's recognition of her stitching was so important. It's the year of the comet, so I made sure the comet was there. The feather in Henry's cap when he consummates his relationship with Anne Boleyn. Cromwell's Cornish chuffs, which are rougher and more aggressive than Wolsey's. I prefer those ones, and I have to confess that I do keep sewing them. Anne's falcon from her coronation, the quill and the scissors from the Holbein painting of Cromwell, which again Peggy has just been talking about. And then in the final part, I was very taken with the idea of cornflowers left in a silver jug. And the text says they were left by someone, probably not Christophe, but I like to think it was Christophe because I like Christophe and I think he would have left them there. And there are items that Cromwell finds in the river, a horseshoe and a coin when he asks, is this Prince Caesar? I put in Thomas More's sticky web of informants, or that spider's web could also be the web that Christophe breaks in the Rolls house. And I finished off with the King's itinerary of how he's going to get from London into the West Country, stopping off at Wolf Hall. Now, all this stitching needed a process behind it. And I had a very, very specific process for working out what was going to go into the quilt. Obviously, a lot of it was based on reading and rereading the novels, and then sometimes making very, very quick notes to myself about anything that stuck out. And I ended up with a very large collection of index cards of ideas for motifs, colours that were used, and a list of the people who sewed. And I did all of this on a chapter by chapter basis, rather than having a plan for the whole quilt. I also made extensive use of the audiobooks because last year new recordings came out read by Ben Miles, and I would use those, and as I listened I would make connections, and I put certain rules in place for the quilting process. I was going to listen to the relevant chapter of the audiobook while quilting the corresponding quilt panel. I would listen in order and I would not skip ahead. And that meant that I was listening on repeat quite a lot, but that was no hardship at all. And I often found that I might be stitching a particular thing or a particular word or phrase, and I would hear it being read to me. And this was always a slightly magical moment and it felt there was an extra connection between the sewing and the text. But there were 2 occasions when I did break my own rules, because in one case it was relating to early mass, which is a very, very short chapter, and the reading is 2 minutes and 12 seconds. Quilting the feather in Henry's hat took 4 days, and I needed to listen to something else. There's only so many times you can listen to 2 minutes and 12 seconds of the same thing. And then there are sections in An Occult History of Britain and a lot of Make or Mar, which are full of grief. And however beautifully that grief is read, it's actually I found I was becoming quite depressed working on that section of the quilt. And in the end, I had to stop working on Make or Mar and move on before I'd finished it. And that broke one of my cardinal rules in working on the quilt. And it has left me with a quite nervous feeling about working on the end, particularly of the mirror and the light, which I still haven't managed to listen to being read. I also had rules in place relating to colour. I wanted to celebrate the richness of colour in the book, and so I coded it in to everything that I sewed. In the chapter titles, the colour of the thread that I used refers to something in the chapter, and there is 92 feet worth of stitching around the edge because it's top and bottom, and that is all coded into the novel as well. I mean, of course, it's only me who knows what those codes are, but at least they're there. Now, that colour coding in the quilt did lead me to make one slight anticipation. Like Peggy, I noticed the reference to gardener's robes being like black feathers, and I put them into the paternity chapter as Wolsey's Cornish chuffs, as a reference to gardener's furs. And I didn't realise that the chuffs don't actually appear for another 2 chapters. They're first mentioned in Visitation. And I know, because I sewed it, that these chuffs are doing double duty and that what they represent is gardener's furs. But it could and maybe does look like I made an error. And of course, later on, I added more chuffs with Cromwell's own. And as I said before, they're much rougher and more aggressive. And actually, they're much more fun to sew. I kept records of everything. I photographed everything as I was working on it. I would log what I was working on when, and this enabled me when I went backwards at the end to see what was missing, to just check what I might have missed as I was working through it. And I also used maps as well, because I had the quilt in pieces until I'd finished working on all of the motifs and the added lettering. But I needed a key so that I knew what all the references were. And looking back over this, it does surprise me sometimes, some of the things that aren't there. But it's not surprising, because I might have had 20 or 30 items written out on my index cards to be included, and there was only room for 5 or 6 of them to be stitched in. And perhaps it's just as well that I don't see this quilt as a one-off, because I have actually started doing smaller pieces relating to it as well, and addressing some of the gaps that I left. The quilt stayed in pieces until the very end. And after 8 months of quilting all sorts of things, I finally finished it on the 19th of August at 3 minutes past 1. And until that day, as I say, it had been in pieces, and joining it took me 5 days, and it got longer and longer and heavier and more twisted. But as you can see, I was really quite pleased to see the whole thing actually being together, and the length of it, even though I could see it in the pieces, the length of it was really quite surprising. But I couldn't actually see what it looked like because it was so long, and I didn't see what it looked like until I had it photographed. I worked with a photographer who specialises in textiles called Michael Wicks, and he told me that it's often the case with large-scale pieces that people can't tell what they've actually made until it's photographed. And at his studio, we tried to lay it out on the floor, but it was longer than the width of the building, so we couldn't actually do so. And we ended up having to fold it back on itself. But Michael did, I don't know how he did it, some magic trick, I imagine. He managed to get me a photograph of what the whole thing looked like laid out. And to begin with, I couldn't see what I'd made, and I had real difficulty interpreting it as a whole piece. And then I started to think of it as a piece of code that represents my personal response to Wolf Hall. The significance is all in the detail. In my records, I've got the key to unlock all of this, but without these, can the whole piece be read? And indeed, should it be? In the same way that you can't see the content of a book all at once, I feel quite strongly that you shouldn't actually be able to see the whole quilt all at once. And so the only people who've actually seen it in one go are myself and the photographer. It's meant to be rolled in a nod to Cromwell being master of the rolls, so that it only reveals part of its code at any one time. Now, I'm just going to end by saying that this Wolf Hall part isn't the only piece that I'm working on. And I realised earlier today that I have actually started to refer to it as the first Wolf Hall quilt. I've been experimenting with various types of yellow satin because I want to do something relating to Cromwell's own quilt of yellow satin. So I've been playing around with a lot of silk, which is very expensive and very slippery. And I've also started picking off little bits of Wolf Hall. So I've got some chuffs that I did this week because I like them. And I've got some lettering going on as well at the moment in smaller pieces. And as far as the other two novels are concerned, I am taking a different approach because I gave myself such problems with the embroidered chapter titles that I made last year. I decided not to use them. And the shape of the piece for the second and third books is likely to be different. But I am going to retain the process of listening and reading and noting because that really worked and it was incredibly rewarding for me. So I'm now left with this studio piece with the first Wolf Hall quilt, which is actually now just a jumping off point for other work. And of course, what I've got to look forward to is the absolute pleasure of having more very intensive and immersive stitching time with Hilary Mantel's Cromwell trilogy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy. That's fantastic. We are now very delighted to move into our Q&A session. I'm kind of trying to pull all those threads together appropriately of those three fantastic papers. So I don't know if Peggy and David want to pop their cameras back on so we can see their faces as we have our conversation. We've already got 2 questions in the Q&A box, so I will start with those, but please keep them coming in. The first question we have here is a question for David. And Carla Nielsen asked, why choose magic rather than religion to contrast to the law in your argument? Religious pronouncements, like legal pronouncements, have actual power because they are backed up by social and political institutions with punitive powers. How would your argument have to shift if the contrast was between legal and religious pronouncements in Mantel's Cromwell books? Really fascinating question, Carla.
Can you hear me?
I can indeed.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Carla, for that great question. It would be a very interesting way to do it. And I think there would be a really interesting point to be made. I think the argument would have to shift. One of the reasons is that, particularly at the time we're talking about, religion and law are not terribly easy to separate in the way that they are in later periods. And one of the really interesting things going on at this time, but the history of it is a little murky and it doesn't get dealt with as much in the books, is the decline of the ecclesiastical courts, which has started but probably not finished at all by the time that Cromwell is Henry's first minister. And so there's a really interesting question of the overlap of secular and religious law and the gradual sidelining of the ecclesiastical courts. You also have obviously official roles for religious figures in the lawmaking process and proper representation of the bishops and so on. So I suppose the first difficulty is trying to separate them, and I don't know that the text about law in the books it makes that terribly easy to do. The history is murky and the books don't do that much work in that respect. And secondly, I think the really interesting thing you'd have to grapple with would be the fact that in many ways, Cromwell sees bad religion as magic, really, and sort of sees the worst elements of religion that he's trying to extirpate as magical in nature. And I think largely sees the good aspects of religion as largely in the head. And in that, I think there's something really interesting to be written about Cromwell as a sort of Mantel's Cromwell as a precursor to sort of church-state separationism. That sort of often contemporary separationism in law and religion is accused of being archly Protestant because Protestant religion tends to focus on the internal experience of God and not on action, whereas other religions tend to be much more about action and imprinting sort of religious belief onto the world. And so I think there'd be something absolutely fascinating to be written, and I think I would probably want to focus it more on that overlap of those two, and the places where I think Cromwell was probably instrumental in pushing aside something like the ecclesiastical courts to sort of keep it away from the law, but at the same time, obviously having, I think, a very sincere faith and far from thinking that God should be out of the law, but perhaps separationists in that sense of largely seeing religion as something of thought and not something of action, which I think maps very interestingly onto contemporary separationist debates. So really fascinating question, and would be a brilliant project. I think it would take me slightly further away from, at least as I'm currently thinking of it, from the point I was making in this one, but it's a brilliant course. I need to give it more thought. So thanks for that.
Thank you very much, Carla. Steve adds, is religion simply officially sanctioned magic? An interesting kind of possible discussion point there. Caroline Brenner has a question for Lucy, and she asks, are there any other books you have quilted? I feel like yes.
No, I was doing a lot of work a few years ago when I was writing my thesis on a film about Nelson, and I did a whole series of Nelson quilts, because one of the ways that I deal with my research is to sew it. So there was a huge Nelson series that I did, but this is the first time I think that I've used, yes, it must be, it's the first time I've used a book like this, but I have been using text for about a decade, so that's not new.
That's really, really fascinating. And what a text to choose for your first kind of exploration of that intersection. I just commend your bravery and the beautiful object you've produced. So I had a question, and I'm going to take chair's privilege and jump in, because I think we've run out of questions in the Q&A for now. So a question for the entire panel. When you were all speaking, it really struck me that something that brought together your papers was this idea of interpretation, the possibilities of interpretation, not simply the act of the creator, the writer of the text, the creator of the tapestry, the creator of the painting, but how we interact with that object and what we bring to that object. How do you think Mantel positions that act of interpretation, either of art, of law, of language, of tapestry? For example, there's a lot of kind of consideration of the depictions in tapestry. How do you feel that Mantel kind of deals with that notion of what we bring, what her characters bring to these objects, these texts? I don't know if Peggy wants to kind of jump in there, and then we can move across.
Actually, I have something to say about this. Hilary Mantel has incredibly good taste. She's got an incredible eye for home decor. At one point, she has Liz Cromwell, well, Lucy will know this, stitching up a shirt for her son Gregory. She makes all of the clothes, the furs, the feathers, the rug. Thomas More buys a carpet and invites Cromwell over to look at it, and Cromwell's thinking he got robbed, you know. He's thinking this is a terrible purchase, but he finds a diplomatic way to say it's beautiful. And then Thomas More says to him, should I hang it on the wall or should we walk on it? And Cromwell says, oh, walk on it. And that's not just Hilary Mantel having taste, but knowing the difference between a good rug and a bad rug, or knowing the difference between a fabulous rug and a so-so rug. And this, of course, is why, you know, I read for a living, like everyone who's, you know, present here today. And I'm pretty choosy about what I read. And when I first read Wolf Hall, and I thought, again, I've read them all. When I read First Hall, I really felt that I was seeing magic. that for one person, the limitless intelligence of this writer, you know, includes the ability to read art. I mean, I'm an art historian the way Pinocchio's a real little boy, which is to say not. But I think that was pretty cool that I picked up those two dogs, right? No
100%.
one else has noticed that that in the Locke revision of the painting done 70 years later, he inserts two dogs that never existed. Hilary Mantel picks up that kind of thing all the time, with home decor, with the food they're you know, considering, with what the children are playing with. It's I don't know, an extraordinary eye for interpreting what what must have been domestic reality. And and the unpacking of Wolsey's house, the packing and unpacking of Wolsey's house. She really knows what, she really knows what she's doing. There's not one false step.
So great. We've got this idea of kind of detail, kind of the process of interpretation, needing that granular detail to really kind of fire. Awesome. David, what did you want to say about this idea of how Mantel thinks about the interpretative process, our own as readers, her characters?
Yeah, I mean, it really does seem to me, and I think it's a point that Eileen has made in her work as well, but that there's so much of her work is about interpretation, and you can read, I think, an awful lot of her work in the idea, with the idea that changes in time will bring changes in perspective and therefore understanding. And I think that's very present in Wolf Hall. There's a couple of extremely clear statements about that across the trilogy. The line I quoted earlier about the power is in the hands of the reader and not the writer, but also as Cromwell says, I think to Norris, you know what you meant, I only know what you said. I think in Cromwell we see the sort of the apotheosis of this idea that it's all interpretation, but with two kind of crucial caveats. One, you can control to some degree with the right steps how people interpret, not totally and not completely, and there's some error in that, but you can, for want of a better term, manipulate people in their understandings. And also you can use the malleability of interpretation as a resource, and we see that sort of throughout the books. But one example that hops out to me is when Cromwell sits down to convince Harry Percy that he needs to rethink his understanding of when he took that oath and swore he was never married to Anne Boleyn. And he puts to him all sorts of absurd scenarios they both know aren't true, and sort of an offer. And, as Mantel has sort of said of her own work and history, that she's making an offer of a version of events for you to accept or reject, that it seems that the author's intention or the writer's intention is an offer of meaning. It's ultimately up to you to take it or leave it. And I think that dynamic is explored so interestingly in Cromwell's actions.
Absolutely. I think that notion of the offer that is made, and whether we take it or not, is picked up by Steve's comment here in the chat around the limits of interpretation seem to be highly bounded. This idea of authenticity being important there. Awesome. Lucy, do you have anything to add, this idea of the figure of the interpreter?
One of the things that happened when I was working on the quilt was I got to the point of trying to work out what to do with the words, just words quote, and what to do about Thomas More. And somebody contacted me and said, I love Thomas More, I love A Man for All Seasons, don't you dare demonize him in Stitch. And I kind of thought, and I had some real problems with that, because I was thinking, well, I wouldn't make a quilt about A Man for All Seasons, sorry, I'm doing this about Wolf Hall, and so what I'm talking about is Mantel's interpretation of Thomas More. And I was quite interested in the way that readers will take these novels and have such strong attachments or not to particular characters. And I get the impression from something that I saw in an interview with her that she's used to the, she likes the idea, this book is out in the world now, so people are going to respond to it in all sorts of different ways. And there are ambiguities in the text as well. There are obviously deliberate ambiguities, so you can read it in multiple different ways, I think. Yes, that's my immediate response to that. I think it's just interesting the way different people will respond to different points.
Absolutely. I think the way that readers sometimes leap in to fill the gaps that Mantel has left in these texts is very telling. So Terry asks a very pertinent question around another long work of stitchery, the Bayeux Tapestry, which is very topical as I'm speaking to you from Normandy. So the Bayeux Tapestry also narrates a critical story, writes Terry. Do you think there are more similarities or more differences between your long quilt and the Bayeux Tapestry?
Do you know, it's funny because I didn't see the connection between the two things. And then I was I was talking to, before I started working with Michael, who did my photographs, I was talking to a different photographer, and she started talking about the Bayeux tapestry. And we started to look for something with Bayeux that would be clickable links so we could see what was going on. Now, I think that's actually been launched this year. And she was the first person that mentioned that to me. It certainly wasn't in my head at all when I started, but I can absolutely see why now. That's the parallel that gets drawn, and I do have a friend who does refer to it as the Bayeux tapestry, but it's nothing like as long, and of course that was done by multiple hands as well. So if I did all three novels, the lengths might probably be in the same way. I think the lengths might be similar.
I will be absolutely fascinated. I guess you've got the embroidery version of a monograph there, and we might think of the Bayeux tapestry as an edited collection.
Yes.
Yes. I think fantastically, we're running perfectly to time, and we probably have time for Kevin's question here. And Kevin says, something really interesting that I see running through all of these papers is the idea of ekphrasis. Rhetoric, painting, quilting, lots of different forms of art running through the novel. Is there something about the novel form more generally, or Wolf Hall specifically, and its intersection with other art forms that is essential here? I don't know who wants to kind of have first bite at that particular cherry.
I think Wolf Hall specifically, not all novels are capacious enough or learned enough. I just read a novel that I had to read it because it's written by someone I know. And I was so miserable the whole time because it was just one cliche after another, and, unsupported allegations and sweeping generalizations. It got a fantastic review in the New York Times. And compare that to a masterpiece like the Cromwell series of, like the Cromwell trilogy. And you see that Mantel has an extremely large, I called it before an intelligence, I don't know a better word for it, where she is like one big ekphrastic viewer. She takes in architecture, she takes in painting, she takes in embroidery, she takes in every imaginable work of human hand. And I think it's partly the greatness of her work, and in her other novels as well. We're here only to speak of, I think today we're here only to speak of the Wolf Hall trilogy, but not every novel is created equal. The novel form, of course, is not particularly strict. So I guess you could, for example, graphic novels, but okay, that's all I'll say. Someone else might wish to speak to that.
No, it's really helpful. So there's like this idea of the capaciousness of Mantel's writing that allows her to kind of play with that notion of ekphrasis. David and Lucy, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just briefly to say, I think it's a fantastic point. I mean, something that always strikes me about, I think it is, at least for me, in the way that I read her novels, I can just take so much from them that I always find it slightly astonishing. And it always seems to me that, and again, I think running through the papers is this idea that I think is present in a lot of her work, that so much is narrative, that everything tells a story, and that in a way everything is a story. And if you look at any phenomenon object through the right lens, you can look at it narratively and see its narrative importance and its narrative resonance, and therefore see it from a different angle. And I suppose to find her Tudor novels so engaging as pieces of extraordinary historical fiction, pieces of extraordinary writing, where sometimes every paragraph will have something that sort of knocks me out, but then also completely unexpectedly to find them, for me, the most insightful commentary on the object of study that I spend my whole life working on, was really quite extraordinary. And so for me, at least, it's a unique phenomenon.
Fantastic, thank you. Lucy, I'm going to give you the last minute of our session.
I think one of the things that I find really interesting about them, and I think it's demonstrated by the difference in the disciplines that we work in, all talking about the same books from different angles. So David can see all kinds of law parallels in them, and Peggy can look at it from an art historian point of view, and I'm looking at it thinking, wow, I found a really good description of stitching here. And I think the breadth of experience that is brought to to her writing is absolutely extraordinary, and I can't think of anything else quite like it. And I think that if you have a specialism and you're reading these novels, you will find your specialism in them, and that's tremendously exciting.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we've finished bang on time, which I think is a miracle in academic conference circles. I don't know how we've managed it. All that remains for me is to say a huge thank you to Peggy, David, and Lucy for opening our conference today in such beautiful style. I believe now we have a 15-minute break, and our next panel will begin on the hour, I shall say, so as not to confuse time zones. Right, thank you so much. Enjoy your break, get away from your screens, and we will see you very shortly.
Terrific, and thank you, Lucy, for chairing the session.